Hello boys and girls. Today we're going to have a book from the Premier Book for Children, Dean's Premier Book for Children. It's got lots of pictures in it. And today I'm going to read you The Prince Who Hated Noise. Very nice. I'll show you the pictures as we go along. And I hope you enjoy it. It's by Roma Lobel. Once upon a time there was a country named Pamperin. I think it has disappeared by now, because I've hunted all over the maps of the world for it, but I can't find it. There is a funny story told about something that happened when it existed. A baby boy was born to King and Queen of Pamperin. He was the most adorable baby you ever saw, and his parents simply worshipped him. It was obvious from the day he was born that they meant to pamper him and give in to his slightest wish. Foolish, fond parents. What a lot of discomfort they were going to cause to their country. The trouble started a few days after Prince Coco was born. As some church bells near the palace began to peal, the prince set up a terrific screaming and crying. "My beauty, my precious, my royal pettykins, what is it then?" cooed his nurse. The prince didn't reply. You've probably guessed that. He went on caterwauling. "I know," exclaimed the queen, who had come dashing in. "The sound of the bells has upset him. Give orders to have the bells silenced." She shouted out of the window to the sentry. The bells soon stopped ringing, and hey presto, the prince stopped crying. "There you are," announced the queen. "I knew it was the bells. The little lamb is so sensitive that he can't stand noise." Whether it was sensitiveness or cursedness, I don't know, but it soon became evident that the prince couldn't stand any noise. He cried when people sang, he cried when they laughed. He even howled if they talked too loudly. He couldn't stand the sound of the church bells or of music. In short, he just couldn't stand any music at all, any noise. You'd have thought his parents would try and make him grow out of it. Not a bit of it. As I said, they just pandered to him. They gave orders that until the prince himself willed it otherwise, all the noises in the country would stop. It was a royal decree, and whoever disobeyed it ran the risk of either banishment or death. So all music was henceforth forbidden, and the bells silenced. All the street cries were stopped, and all the people ordered to speak quietly, for if you ever knew when Prince Coco might be around. Even the singing birds were caught and removed to faraway countries. This dismal state of things continued until the prince was about 11 years old. By that time the people felt that they had had about enough of it. They began to grumble to one another. "Life's hardly worth living. We never have any fun." At last, they decided to send a deputation to the Prime Minister to ask him to do something about it. The Prime Minister was not slow to respond to this appeal, for he too felt the misery of that awful silence. He started thinking hard, and presently he thought out a plan. "If it works, the prince will be cured and all will be well," he said. "If it doesn't, I shall probably lose my head. Still, I'm willing to risk it." You will remember that all the singing birds had been carried away. Well, what the Prime Minister now did was to catch a nightingale from a neighbouring country and train it to live and sing in a beautiful little wood, where the bluebells made the ground look like a summer sky, and the trees carried their tender green leaves with gentle pride. Now the prince had never been to this wood. So one day the Prime Minister said to the king, "Your Majesty, don't you think the prince ought to start getting acquainted with the country? After all, he is the heir to the throne. so he should know about his people and domain." "You're quite right," replies his august Majesty, and he had a great respect for the Prime Minister's advice. "I shall leave it to you to arrange some little trips." "Very good, Your Majesty," concluded the Prime Minister. He arranged a little trip, during which the royal party was to pass the very wood where the nightingale sang, and at the very time when the air would be joyous with her delicious notes. The King and Queen were also to be of the party. At the hour appointed, and at the day the procession set off. First rode 6 men of the household cavalry on snow-white horses. Next came a carriage containing the Prime Minister and a few other ministers. And following this came the royal carriage with the King, Queen, and Prince. The process was concluded by 6 more men of the household cavalry. Believe it or not, all the horses had their hoofs cunningly muffled so that they would not make any noise. Even the wheels of the carriages were fitted to make them quiet. Well, they went on in a solemn procession. "We're approaching the wood," murmured the Prime Minister. All the ministers trembled a little. How would it end? Then suddenly the procession heard the sounds, the beautiful sounds. "There's the nightingale," whispered the minister. But following on these sounds came ugly ones. "That's the prince crying," whispered another minister. As to the King and Queen, they were overcome with horror. They were completely forgot their own decree. "What is this terrible noise?" yelled the King at the top of his royal voice. It came out of very fine volume, considering that it had been silent for so many years. "Stop it at once!" The procession had stopped, and the ministers all alighted. I think it's a nightingale," said the Prime Minister. The Prince cried on. "Well, catch it, man, catch it! Lasso it! Cage it! Do something to silence it!" ordered the King. The Prime Minister turned dramatically to the party. "Men," he cried, "in the name of the King, I order you to capture the nightingale." The men dashed into the wood, and the chase began. The nightingale flew from tree to tree, and the men followed her closely. And here you can see you've got the men chasing the nightingale and the prince crying. And the prince cried on, while the nightingale trilled on. The chase too continued, but the nightingale was always one jump ahead. She seemed to think it grand fun to be chased, and she sang more and more beautifully and joyfully. Dear, oh dear. "Lasso her, catch her," bawled the King. "We can't lasso her," Your Majesty pointed out the Prime Minister. "She's rather small for that." "I've heard it said that the only way to catch her is to put salt on her tail." "Well, put salt on her tail," commanded the King. "There's some salt in the picnic basket. Put a whole salt mine on her tail. Put salt on her tail. Put salt on her tail." The woods echoed with the cry. They were all so flustered that they didn't know what they were saying or doing, and the chase went on, and the men leapt and climbed and tumbled. Meanwhile, a curious thing had been happening. The prince's wailing had gradually been getting quieter and quieter. They were all so busy that they had hardly noticed this. It was the Queen who first became aware of it. She stared at her young son in surprise, until not a sound came from his lips. "I do believe he's listening to the nightingale," she then said to herself, as she watched his face. And indeed he was. "Why, the prince is smiling," she cried out, presently to the King. The King gazed at the prince. So did everyone else. The prince's smile became happier and happier. "What lovely sounds," he presently murmured. All gaped open-mouthed. They could not believe their ears and eyes. "Lovely, lovely," repeated the prince. Well, what the Prime Minister had hoped for had happened. The nightingale's singing had so enchanted the Prince that he had forgotten his hatred of noise. That indeed was the end of his dislike. After that he came every day to hear the lovely song. Not only that, from that time he had stopped objecting to all the noises. The result of that was that the country became quite normal again, with plenty of music and dancing, and other sounds that had been stopped until now. Everyone was relieved. So were the King and Queen, for they never really liked the idea of having a son who didn't like music. And here we've got a picture of them being happily ever after. The King, Queen, and the Prince, all singing and dancing to the music. Well, I hope you enjoyed the story and you'll join me again for another one soon. Take care and see you soon.